What's up guys and welcome back to askNK. Today we're looking at Blender 3.3, the alpha. So last time we talked about Blender 3.2, the beta. We also teased the fact that Blender 3.3 was in alpha. And to get started with this, you need to go over to blender.org, go all the way to downloads, go all the way to Blender Experimental, and you would see the Blender 3.3, the alpha right here. Now, a couple of disclaimers are some of the updates that are now available here are still in their early implementation, so I would not suggest that you take these things as final products, but more like a concept idea of what would be coming over to Blender 3.3. Some other thing is don't use Blender 3.3 for production, but instead I would suggest that you use it for the experimental purpose that it is for at this point. So with that said, let's get right into it. Here, you will definitely notice something within the UI. There's a couple of changes that we have here. They are quite subtle, but you would notice these changes if you're coming from the previous versions that have been released. So if I flip between Blender 3.2 and Blender 3.3 and flip it back and forth, you would notice that we have something. The title bar has been updated to the dark mode, and this is mostly for Windows users. So at this point, if you're working with Blender 3.3, you would notice that the title bar is set to black, contrary to what we had previously, which is set to white, and I'm up for this. And while we speak about things that I'm up for, if you would like to import OBJs, right now the OBJ implementation for the experimental of the C++ build is now working extremely fine. The last time we talked about this, when we made the announcement of Blender 3.2, this was something that I said you guys should take with a grain of salt, but now if you get the new build, you would notice that this has been implemented. So OBJ import with the C++ rewrite is way faster, contrary to the Python one. And at the same time, if you would like to also export your Alembic, if you simply go over to File, go all the way to Export, and you like to export Alembic right now, you would notice that we have some operator preset. This is something that we don't have with previous versions of Blender, and this is going to be very useful depending on how you get to export your Alembic file. So if you have a specific set of presets, you don't want to repeat this all the time, you can simply set this preset and you can use it any single time that you're working with this. There's also an update to faster JPEG thumbnails. If you're trying to access your JPEG files, the thumbnails now loads faster, which makes a whole lot of sense for those who have a truckload of image files that they would like to select from. If you're now working with the outliner, you can now tell what node you're looking at by just seeing the updates of the icons. And one cool thing that I believe lots of people would actually not notice is this. Let's say, for example, you have a simple cube like this, you go over to your render and you render this. If you take a look right here, you would now notice that we have a show gizmo. Now, this is something that we can literally do without, but it is now here. So if I simply take a look at 3.2 and I do the same render, you notice that doesn't exist, but we have these two tools, the tool that allows you to pan and the other one that allows you to zoom in and zoom out. And that is exactly the same thing that this is doing. So if you take a look at this, we can now turn this off and turn it back on. And I don't know who really need this, but I think, it is just one of those things that is there. And while I'm speaking about this, I think it is worth mentioning that lots of you guys probably have not really taken advantage of the render slot. So what this render slot helps you do is to store stuff. So if I go over to slot 2, this is a little bit outside the conversation right now, but if I go over to slot 2, for example, let's just go ahead and open this up, and I choose to scale this down and probably rotate it, and let's rotate it some more. And if I go over to render and hit the render button, we can now store this in slot 2, have this in slot 1, slot 2, just a tip in case you haven't taken a look at this before. Now, with that said, let's talk about some of the things that you guys have actually wanted to see. And one of them is the hair. So the last time we talked about hair, we looked at this in Blender 3.2, but unfortunately that will not be coming to 3.2. So if you simply have an object like this, and you go over to edit, go over to preference, and go all the way to experimental. And in case you have no experimental within your 3.2, if you go over to the interface, you can turn on the developer extra, and you'll notice that we have experimental right here. So within the experimental, there's a couple of things that are working right now. Some of them are not working right now. So we're just going to talk about the ones that works. The new point cloud type is something that we're going to discuss later, as it simply crashes Blender at this point. And of course, we also have the new curve type that we've mentioned. And the reason why we're coming back to this is because there's a few updates that is now here. One of the cool updates that is here is the support for symmetry. So the last time we mentioned this, we said if you hold down Shift and tap A on the keyboard and you go over to your curve, you notice that we have a random curve and the empty hair. So if I have this object selected and I hold down Shift and tap A on the keyboard and go over to curve, we can throw in an empty hair. Now with empty hair selected, we can now simply switch from object mode all the way to sculpt mode. Now, just before we got to sculpt mode, you would notice that we now have an edit mode. Now, the edit mode is only active when you turn on the new curve tools. This is still in its work, so there is nothing that says that you will be getting anything useful with this right now. But one of the useful things that you'll be getting is this, that around this section, you can now define the amount, the points per curve, and also the curve length. And regardless of defining these things here, if you simply tap N on the keyboard and go over to tools, you would also notice that we have this right over here. So at this point, you can also define this. And like I mentioned previously, we will potentially be getting more brushes here, as you can see that we now have a location for that. So if we would like to add some curves, and let's say we'll now need symmetry to work with this, we can now turn on the X symmetry and we can now paint these curves however we want. Then we can go ahead and paint the curves the way we want. We can increase the amount that we would like to paint at every given time, and you can see something like that. And if we like to play with the curve length, we can also do the same thing here. If we like to do anything like interpolation, we can also do those same things here. And this is pretty sick. So we can do all of that. And once we're done, we can switch over to the comb brush, and we can use the comb brush to sort of align this how we would like it to be. So we've already covered a full video about how you can play with this. So I'm just going to also put that as a link in the description, a card or an endnote, so that you guys can follow up with this. And with that said, let's talk about Grease Pencil. So for a while now, we've actually not mentioned a couple of things that has been happening with Grease Pencil, and Blender 3.3 does come with some new improvement. You go over to your Grease Pencil and you try to make some drawings. Of course you can. So in this case, I could just go ahead and make some drawings like this and move these over to this position, and I can make some more drawings like so. So with this, we have about 2 drawings. So what we have now is you can now throw in a noise modifier, which is not new. Of course, we've actually seen the noise modifier, change stuff like this. But at this point, you can now set the randomization of the noise only happen when you have keyframes. So it's only going to change once you have keyframes. And this is very, very nice. If we go ahead and make a copy, you would notice that we have these changes on keyframes. So if I go ahead and throw in another keyframe and another keyframe, you'd only notice this noise on these keyframes. And contrary to what we had before, where we had this noise all over the place based off the steps, this is definitely something that I think a lot of people would love. And as we speak about Grease Pencil, there's also a tiny update that we have here. So one of the updates that we saw come over to Blender some time ago is if you tap U on the keyboard, you can now select from the different material types that you like to draw with. And if you select the solid fill, of course, you can make some drawings like so. But then in several instances, you might want to sculpt this. And if you switch over to the sculpt mode, by default, you can just go ahead and make some sculpt. Actually, if we test this out with Blender 3.2, you would still notice that we have the very same thing. So if I go ahead and tap U on the keyboard and we do some stuff like so, and if I simply switch these to sculpt, tap F on the keyboard, we can sculpt. So that is cool. But right now, there is a very tiny addition, which you'd notice here, that deals with the brush. So if I click on the drop down, we can do an auto masking for the stroke, which would allow us not sculpt the stroke. We can sculpt every other thing, but not the stroke. And if we click on the drop down, we can also do an auto masking for the material and also for the layers. Let's switch gears and talk about the sculpting branch. There's a couple of updates that you can now notice. Most of these updates, you probably saw them in 3.2 beta. So if I simply go over to the sculpt mode and then I drag this all the way down, you notice that we have the paintbrush. So if you switch to the paintbrush and you start painting at this point, this would automatically switch to the new attribute color. So if I start painting, automatically it switches, and if you click on the drop down, you'll notice that we have that. And something that they've done is once you switch back to your default object mode, you would still have this there. If you switch over to your modeling mode, and let's say we just simply tap this all the way out, you would notice that it switches very, very quickly back to the material. And the same thing happens to shading, the same thing happens to compositing, every other part. But then once you grab the object and then you jump over to your sculpting mode, automatically this now switches. And to a large extent, this makes sense because you no longer need to worry about changing this right here before you get it to work. And once you right click, you can switch over to a different color and you can make some changes. Right click, switch over to a different color, make some changes. You know, you can have as much fun as you want. And this is dope. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. But then there is a new update that is also here. Regardless of all of this that we've mentioned, there's a new update that is here, which is once you go over to edit, go all the way to preference, you can now notice that we have the Sculpt texture paint. So this looks like something interesting that will be coming over to Blender pretty soon. And of course, we have the Sculpt mode tilt support. Currently, this is only supported for Wacom devices, so if you do own one, you will definitely take advantage of that. But the question is, how does this work? This literally just throws in, to the best of my knowledge at this point, this just simply throws in a very tiny update to your viewport called Canvas. So within the Canvas section, you can now switch between different materials, different images, and also different color attributes. So if I switch over from this color attribute, I can now click on the plus sign, define a new color attribute. In this case, I'm just going to make this one all the way to white and click on OK. Let's name this as 001 and click on OK. And now you see we have a new one, and I can right click, go all the way to a different color, make some changes, right click, go to this other color, make some changes. Let's do that. And we can do some other stuff. And like we mentioned previously, once you switch over to your color filter, you can make changes to these colors however you want. If you like to throw in some fill color, you can of course go ahead and do that. So we can click and drag to add some fill color, and this is also nice. But where this actually starts coming in extremely handy is within the canvas, you can now switch between these colors. Of course, you could do this before, but now this just simply makes it a bit more handy instead of traveling back and forth. Also, if you switch over to the material section and you have a couple of materials within this, you can also make some changes. So I can go over here and make some changes right here. Actually, let's just set this to white. And I'm also going to click on the plus sign, add a new material, and I'm just going to let this to be. And if we click on the drop down, you notice that we have two materials. Now, the way this seems to be working is a little bit interesting and a bit confusing one way or the other. I think we're going to figure out what the final result will look like sooner than later. But what I know is if you have any of these materials selected and you click on the plus sign, you can now bring in the base color. And once you bring in this base color, you can now paint on the base color. But you don't see what you're painting currently. And that is just one of the things. You don't see what you're painting currently. You're within the attribute, you don't see it. And for you to literally see what you're painting, you need to switch over your image editor. And within your image editor, you still wouldn't see this because you need to click on the drop down and then select this base color. And that is basically how you get to see it. So we can now right click and go over to a different section and now make this painting. And if you switch over to your shading, for example, so if I go over to the shader editor, you would notice that automatically this has been plugged in. So it is weirdly interesting how this gets to work. And you can now use the canvas to load more stuff. So let's say, for example, this is definitely going to be useful for those that are into sculpting and probably you want to do your hand texture painting yourself. If, for example, you would like to play with the roughness, you can click on that, define how you like the roughness to be like, the texture size, every single thing, click on OK, let that be, and start painting in here. And whatever paint or whatever texture you apply here, because of course, it looks like in coming days, we're definitely going to be getting more textures to be loaded in, as if you click on the new object, you can load in a certain texture and you can use it, or you can load in a certain image and you can use it. Whatever texture you load in here, you probably will be able to use it to texture on the model, have this tied over to the texture that will be tied over to the material. And like I mentioned, for you to see this currently, you need to be in the image editor, and if you click on the drop down, that is where you get to see it. So within this section, if we also click on the drop down, you notice that we have the roughness, but something that is quite weird that I would also love to see, which I believe that, you know, the folks at Blender Foundation are definitely working on, is having some tools here that you can use to texture directly on this section instead of texturing here. Another thing is also being able to preview what you have, see the textures that's happening here, as potentially this would give a much more visual guide to what you are making and also what you're creating. If you're taking a look at Blender 3.1, if you import stuff, you would notice that it comes in with a name, but that is not the same with Blender 3.3, as once you import stuff, it is now considered as new object. And at the same time, if you would like to texture any of this, it is also worth knowing that depending on how crazy in terms of mesh density that you have, that is how long it will take the initial sculpt to actually initialize. So if we switch over to the sculpt mode and we scroll all the way down and we go over to the paint, and then we just simply right click, select the color, let's increase the brush size. If I click and drag, I would need to wait for this to sort of think about it before it initializes. And once the initialization happens, you no longer have issues with this because you can now go ahead and start painting. So you can paint as much as you want and, have a field day. And of course, we can do the same thing, go over to the canvas section, click on the drop down, select a color attribute. And of course, to every color attribute you're creating, this is also sort of thinking about it as well. So once we have that down, we can click on the plus sign. I'm going to set this to 01 like we did before, change the color, which is something that we didn't do. So we're supposed to change the color to white, but that's not a problem because with the color filter, we can change the fill all the way to white. So I'm just going to crank this all the way up, set it all the way to white, click and drag and get this to work. And once you have that, switch over to the color. And in this case, you can now go in, start making some more changes. So let's also make some changes here. So for this example, let's throw in symmetry and make some changes like so. And okay, make some changes like this as well. So once you have the changes that you want ready, you can now go ahead and start rendering this depending on what you want. Now, in certain cases, this might just simply render exactly how you want it. And in some cases, it might just give you some very weird looking colors. Most of the times when you get those results is once you just simply click and drag and call up the color attribute. Actually, let's type in the word attribute. Once you call up the color attributes, not this one, let's just go ahead and get the word attribute. So once you get the color attribute in here, in certain cases, once you have like multiple colors, this will have a hard time selecting a color. So it's just going to be blank, contrary to when you just have one color. So you can now go ahead and select the color that you want, and you can have that there. And if you like to mix these colors together, you can click and drag and get a simple mix. And in this case, I'm just going to get the color mix, click and drag that there, hold these, copy and paste that, drag this down, click and drag this right over there. So instead of having a mix, we can go ahead and throw in a simple add, and we can have that, and we can crank this up, crank this down, depending on what we want. So once we have the add here, let's crank that all the way up. We can also go in and throw a hue and saturation. And with the hue and saturation, click this all the way to the color, and we can connect this color to this section and crank up the, saturation. And that is basically how you get some of these things to work. So once you have this going, you can jump all the way back and switch over to either Eevee or over to cycles and start getting this rendering happening. Now, in most cases, once you take a look here, you would notice that we have the Eevee next. This is still in its works because, we don't really have a huge information about it right now. It's still in its works, and hopefully we're going to get some stuff out of it. But regardless of that, there's still a couple of other features that are here. The USD add volume and VDB export is something that is now available in Blender 3.3. There's also the enable operator preset when exporting your Alembic, which is something that we've talked about. There's also some improvement performance of mesh to point nodes when you're working with the geometry node. We also have the add inputs for vertex creases, which is also something that I believe lots of people will take advantage of. And also the second experimental option for new curve tools. So that is also something that we talked about. And currently, this doesn't seem to have, it doesn't seem to have a lot of things going for it. As if you go over and, throw in that empty right there, and you switch over from here to the sculpt node. If you choose to add any stuff on top of the model and you switch over to edit mode, you'll probably not notice anything that is editable at this point. Neither the curve or the select menus even work. So hopefully by the coming weeks or the coming days, we will potentially get something that works with this. So this is more like it. For those who like to test out Blender 3.3, you can simply go over to the link in the description and download the alpha version and start experimenting with this. Hopefully we're going to be getting a huge update coming over to Blender 3.3, since it's definitely going to be another milestone LTS. Tell me what you guys think about this one in the comment section, and of course if you like this video or you learned something from this, you can go ahead and give a like, and don't forget to share with a friend. And until I see you guys in the next one, peace.